Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Today, my guest is Daniel Rowland, and if you're not familiar with him, Daniel is an audio engineer, a producer, an educator, a music tech executive. He has been part of numerous international tours. He's produced music for an Oscar-winning Pixar film. He's mastered multiplatinum Grammy-nominated albums. He's worked with artists like 9 Inch Nails, Seal, Meek Mill, Phillip Glass, Gwen Stefani, and he's even worked with companies like Disney, working on Star Wars and Marvel projects. And as if his list of credentials wasn't long enough, he is also the head of strategy and partnerships at LANDR. And in this conversation, we have a really great chat all about the role of AI in music technology, where it's at right now, where it's going in the future, different uses for it. And he also tackles a lot of the criticisms of it right now, because with AI being new technology and with it just starting to make its way into the music industry right now, there's certainly a lot of backlash against it. And Daniel does a great job of tackling those hard issues. And really, I think at the end of this conversation, you're going to have a new appreciation for the audio industry and where this technology is heading and how we can use it. And yes, there might be some things that are uncomfortable to embrace with this new feature, but there are also a lot of positive outcomes from this as well. And we definitely get into all of that in this chat. So with that being said, let's just jump right into the interview because I think you're going to find this very, very fascinating. Daniel Rowland, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How are you today, man?
I am awesome, man. Thank you for having me, Mike.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on. For people who might not be familiar with you, who you are, and your background, how you got into all of the awesome stuff you're working on these days, can you give us that story?
Sure. I'll try to make it, reasonably short here. So
I love when people go long because you always get the best stuff when people go long.
Well, we all have our individual long and winding roads, right? So mine is certainly no different. I may even have come into the industry in a weirder way than a lot of people, who knows. But so I started, like a lot of people, as a guitar player. As a musician, playing in clubs and stuff when I was about 15. And did that, I'm in my 40s. I was the Gen X, kid back then. So it was a lot of, Pearl Jam and, Alice in Chains and 9 Inch Nails and that kind of stuff. Bands some of which I've gotten to work with since, which has been, we'll get into, but
That's amazing.
So just playing in clubs from about 15 to 25, managing a grocery store so I could just kind of do gigs, right? And drink a lot of beer and party in a small town. Was in Charleston, South Carolina, is where I grew up. And no real aspirations to do anything beyond that. I wasn't even making albums back then. It was just about, playing and partying and that whole thing. So I eventually went to college when I was about 26, right? So I went pretty late compared to most people. I had attempted it when I was younger, but I was just too crazy, man. It just wasn't working for me. I couldn't get my brain around music theory. I tried to go for music, things that I love now and come fairly easily to me. But for whatever reason at that age, I have a lot of empathy for people who struggle with, audio theory or your music theory or all these different types of things, because it's not as easy for some of us as it is for others. But I'll get into that as well. Anyway, so I went to school, University of North Carolina at Nashville, and got a bachelor's of science in music technology, and then immediately after that, got a master's degree in it as well in Nashville at MTSU, which I've been teaching at for about 15 years. I'm a professor of music technology there. And that kind of got me. I came into the industry totally backwards, right? So I started as kind of a half-assed guitar player, ended up going to college, for music and music technology, and then started working in the industry after that, seriously in the industry. So it was when I got out of grad school that I met a guy named Adrian Ballou, who some people will know, listening to this, some won't, but he's a fairly well-known guitar player and singer, and he was the, frontman for King Crimson for 30-something years. He was with Frank Zappa, Talking Heads, David Bowie, 9 Inch Nails. Just all these crazy artists. He's played on hundreds and hundreds of albums. And he and I became partners in crime and produced, God knows how many hundreds of songs together, toured around the world, made, mobile applications for music production and all sorts of different things. And that was kind of what kicked off my career. And, I ended up working with Disney and Pixar and a whole bunch of people after that. So again, I don't want to be too long-winded about this, but that was how I got into things. Was through going to school and then through working with Adrian.
That's amazing. So at that point, were you doing was there mixing and mastering that you were doing at that point, or was it like just focusing a lot more on the tech side of it and, like you said, like building apps and that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I when I met Aid, I originally was being a guitar player, I was super into using, a computer for crazy guitar sounds and to kind of, make my rig smaller. Like I love guitar pedals, but for moving around, I was kind of into the computer side of things. So Adrian had this massive guitar, ridiculous, like 80s guitar system, like when he used to tour with Bowie, and it's like you can't tour with that anymore. It's too expensive, right? You need to downsize. So I kind of came on board with him to do that, to take his, whatever the 70 pedals he was touring with and all the rat gear, and see what we could get into the computer or an Axe FX and a Kemper, and like how much we could downsize it. And that's kind of how we kicked it off. And then I eventually built his studio in Nashville and was his audio engineer. And then from that became co-producer on everything. So it was kind of moving up the chain sort of to where we were partners on stuff, which was great. And yeah, that involves, by the way, I was recording everything, mixing everything, and mastering everything.
Wow. That's very cool. I love that. Like, I think that, before we started recording, you were talking about how there are a lot of different types of jobs that people can get in the music industry aside from just being in the studio. And, your example there of just like helping people downsize their rigs is like, that is a job that people do need. And probably there's probably good money in it because there's big acts touring that have lots of gear and they need to downsize, and it helps save them money too, right?
Yeah, and I wasn't even thinking about that when we were chatting about that earlier, but you're right. I mean, that became a thing that I did. So for other bands, so forget about just guitar systems, right? Even with Nine Inch Nails, when I worked with them a bit, getting them on the Kemper and like making it so they could tour in a little more of a compact fashion. But even that also goes for live sound rigs, right? So for bands like metal bands like Accept and stuff like that, taking their, allowing them to tour with their own rig and not rely on the house system every night, meaning they could have predictable intermixes every night, and all their automation could be taken care of on stage with the pyro and all that. So I did a fair bit of that too, which came out of this my experiences with Adrian 100%.
I love that. That's so cool. So were you, being a guitar player, I'm sure you were already familiar with a lot of that stuff just out of your personal interest, I'm sure, right? Or were you just trying to figure it out on the fly?
Most of it I was figuring out on the fly. I was super familiar with Ableton. I was super familiar with Max MSP and that side of things, and like crazy MIDI routing and all of that. But a lot of the live sound stuff I wasn't super familiar with. I was more a studio rat. So that definitely there was a little bit of a learning curve for there. And dude, I'm always figuring shit out on the fly. That's kind of my MO. It's like dig a hole, jump into it, and find a way to climb out. So I commit to stuff that I have little idea about. I just kind of trust that I'll navigate. And I tell that to my students all the time, right? Just like, as long as you kind of believe in your ability to ingest information and find mentors and all that stuff, like, don't turn down opportunities just because you don't think you're good enough or you don't have the knowledge base.
For sure. It's funny. It's like, that's one of the themes that I find pops up a lot on this podcast is people that have just said yes to something without having any experience in it before. And those always end up seeming to lead to the coolest gigs and, the longest careers, because it's just something that, you just fell into, but you're good at, or you have enough interest in it and you pursue it longer. And, it's really interesting. So yeah, you were doing all that stuff. You were engineering at the studio, and then how did you get to where you are now, where you're a mastering engineer, like a full-time mastering engineer on your own? You're working with LANDR. You're teaching. You got all this cool stuff going on. So what was that transition like?
Yeah, this is maybe another just interesting thing for people to hear. So I had never had any intention on getting into like the music technology space on the development side, right? I was just a nerd, who loved pedals and software and gear, right? For making and manipulating sound, not building it, right? So and I alluded to this earlier. So I was on tour with Adrian, we were in Amsterdam for like a month working with the Metropole Orchestra. Adrian had written this whole album that the orchestra was doing, so we were there recording that and doing the live performance stuff. And I met a guy now who I've worked with on a number of projects over the years, Nick Mueller, at a whiskey bar in Amsterdam, which is like the beginning of every great story. And anyway, he was a mobile developer, so for mobile applications, right? And we started talking about like cool stuff. I'm very much into, and have been for 12 or 13 years, the iPad as a musical instrument and all the just totally unique things people have built for that multi-touch interface that could not exist on desktop. And there's just some amazing things that I've used creatively. And he was like, hey, so what would you build in a perfect world? So we kind of came up with some apps that we ended up putting out with our company Noise. Like multi-touch, like chaos pad on steroids, effects processor type stuff, and like an album that never plays the same way twice every time you listen to it with interactive visuals and just a bunch of really artsy stuff, right? Not things you're going to make $1 million on. Anyway, I was at South by Southwest maybe 8 years ago speaking and presenting about one of these apps that we had made, right? So those apps were kind of my gateway into the music tech side of things. And to be clear, I'm not so that might sound cooler than it is. I'm not a programmer. I wasn't like getting in there and, in C and doing all this stuff. No, I'm a guy who knows a lot about sound and a lot about the technology to make sound as a user. And a lot of companies need opinions from people like me and probably a lot of people listening to this to know what the hell to build. They might be great at coding, but they're not the hardcore end user of the things that they're building. And that's a lot of times when you see products come out that aren't amazing and don't really seem to have a product market fit, it's because they didn't kind of dovetail those two sides of the conversation, if that makes sense. So I came at it from the user side, right? And while I was at South by, LANDR had seen me, I guess, apparently I had linked to LANDR somehow on LinkedIn, and I didn't even remember doing that. The company wasn't even called LANDR at the time. It was called Mixed Genius. So they had anyway found me at South by, and we went and had dinner. And they kind of told me about this, what they were attempting to do on the machine learning side of things as far as applying it to music production, right? Which hadn't really been done at any scale at that time that I'm aware of. And, yeah, that was kind of how I got involved with LANDR. And I thought it was a cool idea, and we'll talk about why I thought it was a cool idea. They were used to having audio engineers like throw rocks at them, as you might imagine, for like destroying the music industry, which I think people realize now didn't happen. But there's a large underserved area of the music making community in kind of the modern world that needs to be addressed there. But we'll get into that. Anyway, that's how I met him. And now I work with LANDR. I've worked, with other music tech companies at this point. I'm heavy in the Web3 space. I just spoke at Google a couple of weeks ago about that. I mean, I do partnerships with all the major Avid, Ableton, everybody. So I'm super immersed on the business side now, kind of with LANDR as well as on the tech development side, because we build plugins and, LANDR is like, 10-20% mastering at this point, and then all this collaboration and samples and other stuff that we do. It kind of grew a lot over the years. Anyway.
Yeah, that's so cool. And you brought up a really good point there about the idea of just like these companies needing people to almost consult on like how the music industry actually works and not just be like a tech company. And it's funny because we were talking before we recorded it as well about just with Zoom alone, and how like, I record so many of these chats on Zoom and like all of the engineers have problems with it, It's like, it hasn't been built with an audio engineer in mind. It's just, with the general consumer. So I'm sure there's a lot of applications that people could use Zoom for that would benefit from having an audio engineer consulting with them, So that's another amazing avenue of business and of work that people could get in this industry that isn't just that traditional studio route. So
you're totally right, and that applies, outside of just music creation tools. I mentioned the Web3 thing, right? I mean, there's some people, blockchain native people that are building amazing stuff for music on that side of things that aren't music industry natives, right? So like I work a lot with that side of the fence these days because you already said it, they need insight from people like us, but that applies to car audio. It applies to, there's just so many places where your knowledge and insight as a musician and, certainly if you're on the tech side of things as well and you understand the tools is valuable. So I digress, but I just encourage everybody. It opened up a whole new world for me when I started getting into the music tech side of things and realized, I always had so much trepidation about that because I'm not a coder. I don't know this. I don't know that. And just kind of putting all these hurdles in my way. But when I actually opened up and had a conversation with some of the people building these tools, I realized how valuable my opinion was. And my opinion is no more valuable than you or anybody else listening. I just was able to stumble into a position where I could kind of voice it.
For sure. Well, that's really awesome. And yeah, it definitely makes sense why LANDR would choose to work with you because you've obviously had that experience. And, for a company like that who's trying to put something to a mass market and, get, I guess originally it was kind of known for being a primarily mastering based company, right? So like to have a mastering engineer behind the scenes helping them out, that definitely helps out a lot. So now you're the head of strategy and partnership at LANDR, right? Is that your official title there?
That is, I don't even know what I do for LANDR anymore, but that is my official title, whatever that means. Yeah. So that now I was their senior audio engineer. Now we have a team of, senior audio engineers and, work with a lot of external mastering engineers too, Howie Weinberg and people like that to help kind of inform the engine. But mostly I've kind of pivoted away from working on the mastering side and I'm more focused on plugin development, partnerships, kind of where we're heading. Cause, what we kind of learned from our users, and we're not the only company that's gotten this feedback, is, people, we got, LANDR started, as you've already said, as most people know, is AI mastering, and it didn't particularly sound very good when LANDR started. And over the years, like a lot of things has improved and is pretty awesome at this point. We'll talk about where it is and where it isn't awesome. Mm-hmm. But our users were like, hey, if you're doing mastering, what about distribution? So we're like, okay, so what do you do? And that's kind of the next step in the creator journey. So we got into the distribution space, getting your music out to DSPs, which has gone well. And then it was like, okay, well, let's move back to the left in the creator journey. So we are, offering samples and plugins and, instruments and collaboration tools. I mean, we have our own version of Zoom that's built just for, music creators. So you can connect your DAW to somebody else's DAW for free. And stream high quality audio as an example, or project management in the cloud, and just anything basically from the moment of ideation all the way through distribution and monetization. If you want to connect, you want to hire. By the way, LANDR has dozens of mastering engineers on our platform that you can hire. So LANDR's not trying to push people towards automated mastering anymore. It's no, come on, hire Howie Weinberg, hire me, hire anybody else at various price points who've probably worked with some of your favorite artists. Do that. It's not the core focus of our business anymore. The core focus of our business is shepherding people, through their creator journey and meeting them where they are and getting them what they need. And that's kind of it.
I love that. And that's actually, I also fall in that category of knowing LANDR as being that AI mastering engineer,
sure.
And so I have found it interesting to see the development of all these things. And I love how you put it of the creator journey and just really trying to cover all of those tracks and, really help out people. Now, I'm curious to know, you did allude to the fact that, LANDR isn't for everyone. So I'd love to talk about, who are you picturing this being for and who is it not for?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, I still make a big chunk of my money mastering, so it's I don't want mastering to go away. I'm incentivized to not eliminate mastering engineers, and which isn't the goal, right? So look, I guess I'll say this for starters. I mean, a lot of people, if you think LANDR is the devil, it's totally all good, right? The reality, though, is a lot of people who think that are usually older cats who are from a different era of the music industry and kind of, fetishize that a little bit. And I respect that, right? The reality is that, human mastering engineers are awesome. They're more versatile and they can do, well, maybe not more versatile, but they can do more nuanced things, right? I think even with Justin Perkins, who was on your podcast, who's an awesome mastering engineer, he was talking about some of the parts of mastering that are beyond just the sonic side of things, right? But if we're living in a singles world, right? And even, by the way, LANDR can master albums too and does quite a good job of that. There's a massive part of the music making population that don't even own a microphone that costs $100, right? The majority of the world that makes music. So the idea that they would spend, $200 to get a mix done is crazy. And the idea they would spend $75 or $100 a track to get a song mastered by a good mastering engineer, right? Not just somebody who's going to half-ass it. It's just never going to happen, right? It's great to say that they should, but that's not reality, right? So I would say probably 80 to 85% of people who make music cannot afford a mastering engineer. I've worked with artists who are well-known artists who don't get their music mastered, right? Or they kind of do it themselves and half-ass it in a way that's not great. So that's kind of where the LANDR and the other, companies in the machine learning AI, quote unquote mastering space come in, is to kind of fill that gap, because there's this massive void where you have people who don't have the knowledge to master themselves. They don't have the gear, they don't have the room. And then you have people who can't afford it regardless, right? So what do you do for those literally tens of millions of people that are making music? And that's where we kind of fall in.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it definitely seems like it's catering more to kind of that earlier stage musician who's getting their career started and, maybe, yeah, like you said, maybe doesn't have that budget to to really get it going, right?
Well, and I say that, but there's a lot of labels that use it too, man, because, the reality is, and again, mastering is a very important part of the creative process, right? Mm-hmm. But mixing is more important. So if you have a budget and you've got to spend that budget, your best bet is to get the best possible mix engineer you can, because it means the mastering engineer isn't honestly I just did a Manny American mix last week. I mastered it, and there's not a whole hell of a lot you need to do to his or Pensado's or Derek Ali's mixes, because they're badass mix engineers and they know how to mix loud, and you're really just there to QC and maybe do a little subtractive EQ and get things out to the world. So like the reality is, if that's the focus, mastering's not magic, right? I think most people here know that. You're only working with the mix that you get, just like a mix engineer is only working with the tracks that were recorded, and you can only make things so good. So I think we see a lot of that, and it goes to something we were talking about earlier. Where's LANDR not awesome? And this goes for any AI. It's not awesome when the mix is terrible. Right? So if a mix is good, LANDR is going to be great, honestly. If the mix is got, the bass is 6 dB too hot, it's sibilant as hell, there's pops and clicks all over the place. Like, there's no AI that's really going to effectively address that. You need a human to go in and be surgical on that. And really what you need is that person to go back and revisit their mix. And we're even, putting up flags now where we try to tell people and point out where deficiencies are that we might not be able to deal with, but we can identify at least at scale on the AI side of things, so they can maybe go back and address that and point them towards educational materials and whatnot. And it's why we started I realize I'm ranting a bit about this. It's why we started this LANDR network thing that we have, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's where you can go hire a mixing engineer or a mastering engineer or a vocal producer or somebody just to give them $30 and they'll give you feedback on your mix or your master and not do it for you, but really point you in the right direction. It's because, you need everything, right? Like the AI thing's good for some people. You need human touch with other people. You need a hybrid for other people. We just want to kind of serve, both sides of the market.
I love that. I think that that's super useful. And thank you for clarifying, when LANDR works and when it doesn't, and what things to be looking out for. Because I do think that is where a lot of the criticisms come from, right? It's like people are like, oh, I threw this like crappy mix into LANDR and it didn't really make it sound that much better. It's because you sent it something crappy, right? So like, and another thing you mentioned too that I think is really interesting is you kind of mentioned that, there's not much to mastering in some ways, you know what I mean, comparatively to mixing, right? Like there obviously is a lot in mastering, but I think that for years mastering engineers have kind of had like this like protective armor around the topic and treated it as if mastering was this like dark art that nobody really knows and shouldn't understand, but only these certain people know. And it's like now we're starting to realize like, okay, wait a minute, like it's not quite that way, It's like the internet opened up the doors and now people can see like what was happening behind the scenes, and it's like, oh, that's all you're doing, and a little EQ, some limiting, this and that, So it's funny. So I definitely feel that services like LANDR, it does make sense to use it for all the reasons you mentioned there, and it makes sense to not use it for all the reasons you also mentioned too, right? It's like,
yeah, it's totally true. I mean, if you're Eminem and you're putting out your next record, you're not using LANDR to put that out, right? You've got a budget to go hire Bob Ludwig or whoever you're going to go hire and do that, right? LANDR is not, if you want to do vinyl mastering, right? Like we have a lot of people who master vinyl, spit vinyl out through the low setting on LANDR, but it's not exactly the same approach as like I might take if I was a mastering engineer, right? So there's certainly, there's reasons to use it, reasons not to use it. A lot of people, and the last thing here, don't ever release anything that was mastered with LANDR, but they're some of our biggest users. So they're like film composers are a big chunk of our users who are just people who have to churn out so many demos, so many revisions constantly as they're working on film cues, use LANDR for that. Now, when it comes time to actually get the soundtrack mastered, they come to me or they come to another mastering engineer, but they're using LANDR for all these different versions that come out, in the meantime. And then other people who just use it for mix versioning, we call it, which is, I think Justin may have mentioned this when he was on the podcast, which is where like, I just want to hear what my mix is going to sound like kind of when it goes to mastering. I may still go to a mastering engineer, but I can push my mix into LANDR and see, as it's processed differently, kind of if there's something that I might need to adjust in the mix to better prepare it for mastering. And that's another big use case of ours. So, and hell, we have people who do sound design for film who drop like 100 gunshot effects into LANDR and just have those, treated. Like, it's bizarre some of the stuff people use it for now, or they just use it for their drums in a mix. I mean, it's one of the interesting, I've said this before, but one of the interesting parts about working and building on technology is seeing how people use it in ways you'd never even envisioned, and that's certainly been the case for us.
That's very cool. What are some of the most creative uses that you've seen? Obviously, you mentioned like the gunshots and the drum stuff, but anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, that's been interesting. I mean, people intentionally destroying their mixes. I mean, intentionally clipping the hell out of them, intentionally, limiting jacking the bass up, doing crazy things and pushing into LANDR as a sound design tool to see how it can address that and then using that in a track. So like samples and stuff, which is another really interesting one. Like I'm actually a fan of this, trying to break the LANDR engine, right, for the purpose of sound design. I mean, that's the thing I learned from Adrian Blue, from Trent Reznor, and all these people is like, find a piece of technology and make it do something it wasn't intended to do, and something cool might come out of it. We've had people do that. So it's kind of, it's all over the map these days. But yeah, I mean, people who just use it for guitars as an example, but not on their master mix. So
that's super cool. And I never thought about it that way. But yeah, with you having that access to see kind of what kind of uses people are using, I'm sure it just opens your eyes to like all these new things. And I had another mastering engineer on my podcast a while ago who also has his own platform that is in somewhat direct competition to LANDR, but he framed it as if, same sort of thing that you mentioned, where you can kind of reverse engineer the mastering process and see how, from a mixing standpoint, you can really shape your mix to work better for a master. And that I think that's a really important learning curve. And even from my own experience, and I'm sure you can relate to this as well, if you've ever had songs mastered by a professional mastering engineer, you start to realize like, oh, that's what they do. That's
yes, exactly.
That's the kind of stuff I need to be looking out for. And this is why they had trouble mastering my track. So maybe the next time around I won't do this, and that kind of thing. You really kind of see it from a different lens, and it is a really cool learning opportunity to have mastering done to your projects and reverse engineer that. Yeah.
And even if you yourself want to learn a bit more about mastering, like even if you're not necessarily eventually going to go to another engineer, get to the point where you can make your stuff sound better than you think LANDR sounds, right? Use LANDR as a reference and go beyond. Now, we have people who do. They have people who will stay with us forever. We have 5 million users or something at this point. It's crazy. Some of those love LANDR, are committed to it, understand how to mix so that LANDR will do the best job on it. Others of those people will graduate on some projects and go to a mastering engineer, which is awesome. And others will kind of try to reverse engineer it, as you said, and learn how to master themselves, which is also awesome. So it's interesting to see how people approach it differently depending upon, how much time they have, their proclivity to want to learn the engineering side of things or to hire, humans to do it. So it's all of it's good as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, for sure. So then in your opinion, where do you see this AI technology going as a next step?
Yeah, now that's an interesting question because, it's funny, right? So I kind of, earlier I was talking about, when I first started at LANDR, I was basically putting a big target on my back as an engineer coming on board with a company kind of doing this, right? Because a lot of people just they see the way things were and they don't see the way things could be, right? And they have their thing, and that's cool. But no new technology would get built. We would never had digital technology, no DAWs have gotten built if we let tape cats tell us what should and shouldn't be happening. And I love tape, but those are not necessarily the people who should be innovating or have the capacity to do that. Now, there's problems with that though, because so LANDR came in and is kind of, in the mastering space, not trying to replace mastering engineers, but trying to serve, a massive part of the market that unless mastering engineers are going to charge $5, they're not serving. Fine. That was controversial. It still is controversial today, certainly for some people, but way less because what's happened is that AI has been applied to other more sensitive areas of the music creation process that touch more people. I'm specifically talking about the AI composition side of things, right? So AI mastering and mixing will be built into most major DAWs in the next 5 to 7 years. So I think everybody's probably aware of that, but it's actively being worked on, and not by us, by the way. but it will be a thing where it's just native to DAWs, right? You'll be able to get a basic mix. I mean, I already thought this would be a thing, but it's taken a lot longer. If I want a Rolling Stones mix or a whoever mix, a Metallica mix, I can get the approximation of that, at least a place to start in a DAW with a button press. So that's put that on your radar. That's happening.
You think that like AI mixing is going to be a thing then, eh?
Oh, I don't think it's going to happen. I know for a fact it's a thing. Yeah.
I mean, the writing's on the wall. Obviously, if you have like the mastering step, it's like, well, the next step is going to be getting into the weeds and mixing, right?
Well, I mean, it already exists to some degree. I mean, look at what Isotope's doing with Neutron and things like that, right? If it were that functionality built in natively, see, this is with a problem with a lot of the machine learning stuff. It's not native to the DAW. It's either like LANDR's a cloud-based service, right? Or a desktop app that connects to the cloud, or it's some third-party plugin, right? There's some really interesting third-party composition tools like, that Captain Chords and Orb and, Ava's in the cloud and all this other stuff that's going on, but it's not integrated directly in the DAW, so it's not as convenient or accessible to the most people. That's the next step, where that stuff will be either licensed or built by some of the DAW manufacturers so that the tracks can talk to each other, right? And they can do a lot of the stuff that, say, Isotope is doing and others are doing, but built in there anyway. So that's probably the lowest hanging fruit I see for AI and music production, for better or worse. Now, does that mean it's going to replace mix engineers? No, because all it's going to do is give you a starting point that you can then move from, or people who would never hire a mixing engineer will have something they can work from and reverse engineer and blah, blah, blah. I'm less threatened by that than I am the AI composition side of things. Because it's one thing to have a tool, take an Orb Composer Suite, or like I mentioned, Captain Chords, ones that people may know about because they're plugins, right? That allow you to kind of get the basics of an idea up and running. And, plugins that talk to each other. And if I change the bass line, it changes the melody and the chord progression across other ones. That's cool, because I'm actively involved in the creation process. Where that gets challenging for people is when humans aren't involved in the creative process. So if I'm making an ad for TV and I drop my 30-second video into, pick one, Dynascore, which is a company, cloud-based AI composition company, and that their software analyzes that video, lets me put in maybe a couple of points where I think there should be a crescendo or there's an explosion or something like that, and it will just compose music, and I can shuffle through that in any genre I want, and I'm done. Like, there is never a music creative involved in the process. They're specific. It says it on their site, like, you're your own composer, replace composers, right? So I think that scares people a lot more now than the AI mastering thing, when we're taking the human out of the creative part at the inception of an idea. And it's not like, is that going to replace pop stars and rock bands? Not necessarily at the moment, but it certainly is going to hurt on the sync side of things, and it's certainly going to hurt in some of the other opportunities. There are important income streams for people trying to make a career in music. So it's a whole interesting time that we're heading into on that side of things.
That's really interesting, and you're right. Like, with all this technology and the advancements of it, it really does have a lot of potential to, in some ways, it's going to broaden the music industry and it's going to make it more accessible. And I think in that sense, it's really cool. And in some other ways, it's going to, it'll be like the equivalent of Napster coming up again. It's going to be sort of like that, where it's going to shake up the industry in a way that it hasn't seen in a long time. And people are going to have to adapt to that to some degree. Yeah,
it's really interesting. It's hard to speculate on exactly what the effect of some of this stuff is going to be. Maybe it's not that big of a deal, right? Maybe it's a significant change in the way that things work. It's really interesting. Maybe it changed. You could look at it, if you want to look at it in a positive light, maybe if everybody who has a cell phone can push a button, and this already exists, I guess, but if can push a button and make a trap beat that sounds amazing, and everyone knows that they can do that, maybe when they go listen to the radio or they listen to Spotify, they're going to look for something that's beyond what they can do on their own, right? And maybe that's going to evolve their taste, and we'll get some different genres popping up, and a reversion to maybe some musicality that I think is missing from popular music. Who knows, right? But you have applications like Boomy now, which has tons of users, right? Where and actual artists use this too, where you can go on Boomy, Boomy, and hit a button and generate a song and make a couple of you'd have to know nothing about music, very general curation selections, and release that song to Spotify immediately. You don't know if 3-year-old can do it. And there's millions of songs. I mean, God, they just published, I think, 8 million songs or something in the past couple of years from that app alone. And some popular artists use that too, because like in between their tentpole music releases that they really focus on and invest in, it's a content treadmill these days, right? So they just want to have, lo-fi beats coming out and things like that. So they'll use some of these tools to just kind of crank content out. So it's very interesting to see how some of this stuff is used between professionals down to amateurs and people who aren't even amateurs, people who have never even thought about making music before. And that's where a lot of this is headed.
That's super interesting. And yeah, I do find it so interesting how the technology is becoming easier and easier for people to get access to. I remember someone I know, their kids go to a school, and in elementary school, they had a music tech class, and they had kids in like grade 3 who were making like crazy MIDI songs, and I was like, how is this possible? But it's because the technology is there, and even just with a simple thing like GarageBand, for example, just being accessible on people's Macs, it's like people are starting to experiment with it, having fun, trying different loops. So it does. I do find it very fascinating, and it's kind of interesting too, because earlier you had mentioned the idea of like the creative process of music, and mastering has its own creative process, mixing does, the songwriting does. And it's hard to argue whether it's going to be increasing the creativity of music by simplifying it, or if it's taking it away. I think to like a traditional musician, it may be taking away some of the creativity, because now other people have those skills that they've worked so hard for. But at the same time, now more people are going to have that creativity to just experiment with something that they never knew they could do before.
Yeah, and I mean, that'll lead to all sorts of new stuff being created, some of which will be terrible and some of which might be innovative and different because people, are coming at it from a different angle, I suppose, could be cool. But it's also interesting. I have to check myself all the time because I am an old grumpy dude. And I'm like, oh, these new tools let people do stuff that I had to bust my ass to learn, or like they're making crappy music and all this really like privileged, condescending shit that you hear people say. And I can get caught up in that as well. But like, man, people hated jazz when it came out. They hated rock when they came out. They hated synthesizers and drum machines. And remember, plugins were never going to be worth a crap. All the stuff that were cheat codes, right, that people looked at as like, oh, you're not real if you're using digital, or you're terrible, or quantization, or batch fade. You could look batch fades. You could look at all this stuff that, if you really think about it, is kind of semi-automating or replacing something that came before, or is a, quote, simplified version that is open to a different market, right? We're just in a different phase of that these days. A lot of the stuff that we're already so used to, we don't think about in that ways, but those things were disruptive in their time. And now we're seeing that at a different scale, admittedly, particularly with the AI and machine learning aspect of it, but it's kind of just an evolution of stuff that's been happening forever.
Man, I just love your transparency and honesty about all of these topics, because I do think, there are probably people that are going to listen to this and think like LANDR, like, oh, that's taking away from technology or taking away from creativity, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I love that you're tackling both sides of the conversation. And I think people need to hear that,
Yeah, I mean, shit, man, I'm not a salesman. I'm an audio engineer. You know what I mean? I'm a music geek. Like, so... Like, I don't think anyone is served by coming at any topic from an inauthentic angle. And I think that goes for both sides. That comes from my side of the fence, working on some of the tech development, some things that people may deem to be disruptive or controversial. And I think that should go for people who are kind of looking at the market and what companies are doing and judging that. Maybe it's a big part of this. And I had a conversation the other day with somebody about this, and they made a really good point. This is a pretty well-known producer. He said, I don't care about LANDR. I don't see LANDR as good or bad. I care about the people behind the technology. Like, you can use any technology for good or bad, but what's the intent of the people behind it? Are you trying to literally wipe out all mixing and mastering engineers? If that's not the goal, like, tell me what it is. Tell me what the intent is. And he's not wrong. I mean, I have a problem. I love technology, but I'm not embracing of all of it. I have my thresholds that I won't go beyond when it comes to companies, specifically, going after segments of the market that I don't think are necessarily appropriate with AI and machine learning, like actively trying to say that they're going to replace composers and stuff. I'm not a huge fan of some of that. Anyway, so yeah, I think a lot of any kind of tech, for everybody listening to this, it's like, find out what the intent is, find out who's behind it, because that's really going to, dictate what it's used for.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, and I was curious to know, because you are coming from a perspective of being an audio engineer yourself, and now you're consulting these companies that do have the potential to stir up the pot and, that are in some ways causing controversy between like the future of tech and the existing engineers. Do you ever find yourself like feeling hesitant to suggest things that like, or like the things that you're holding close to your heart that you're like, I really don't want an AI company doing this? I mean, feel free to answer that however you want. But
no, it's a good question. Not really. There's just certain things I don't tend to get involved in. You know what I mean? So like I leave that for other people because it's a little, it muddies the waters a little bit too much for me. And I've kind of alluded to what some of that is already. But, it's also interesting though, man, even we were talking about some of the potential positives to come out of a lot of this. And let's just frame it through the lens of being an audio engineer or mixing, mastering, that kind of side of things, right? Like, the more you could look at like, okay, music creation is, again, another step of democratization in the music creation space as anybody can kind of do it. The reality of that is that if we can if the market does open up to a segment that typically would have never considered making music, a percentage of those people are going to get hooked and move on to learn the more professional tools and maybe learn to play a real instrument and do stuff that will require my services and your services and the services of musicians and producers, right? So there's ultimately going to be part of that funnel that feeds into the more professional side of the industry. It's more about how like the music consuming community, the fans out there, how they separate what quote unquote professionals do from kind of the AI generated stuff, right? That's what is kind of nebulous to me at this point. But as far as, AI in general making more work for all of us and not taking it away, I think we've already seen that. I think, with mastering, not to get back on that, but more people know about what mastering is right now than have ever known about it. And that's because of not just LANDR, but other companies kind of in this isotope and other companies in the space that have really kind of opened that door. And I get more work now as a mastering engineer than I did 10 years ago, right? And there's reasons for that, but I think part of it is people actually give more of a shit about mastering. And it's not voodoo anymore. It's not this dark art that they just are afraid to approach. So, we'll see how this plays out across various verticals in the creation process, but it's going to be a really interesting next 5 to 10 years. I know that.
I love that, man. I think that that's a really interesting point to bring up, that you've had more mastering work lately than you ever have. And that's even with all this technology out there. So, it really does go to show that like a properly trained engineer is still going to have work.
Oh, never. It's never going away, ever. Like, if you are good at what you do, you will always have a career, at least in my lifetime, a career doing what you're doing. More content's being made, right now than at any other. More content's being made right now than all mastering engineers or mixing engineers in the world could deal with, right? There's more work out there than there are engineers. You just got to find it.
That's a really good point. And it goes back to sort of what we were talking about earlier of just, how there are so many different avenues for work in the industry. And, content creation itself is like, there's a lot of need for audio-based people in that industry, and making content and, helping people doing that kind of thing. So that's just another avenue right there too. Man, I love this. I think it's such a good conversation to have, just to really show like, this isn't killing the industry necessarily, like it's actually like adding some more opportunities for people. And I like the fact that you said like mastering is just building awareness to the stuff so that the mastering engine, the people that are pursuing it as a career are still getting more work because now people know about it more, so.
Yeah. And I want to be clear because I don't want to sound, like I'm like completely preaching this glass half full sort of a thing. Does it mean that there's some mastering work that's been lost, let's just say because of LANDR or because of O's? Of course, right? I'm just saying that I think what I've seen over the past 5 to 6 years is it's been somewhat balanced too by people, who would have never used mastering, using something like LANDR and graduating beyond that to actual mastering engineers, or us pushing mastering engineers from the higher. So I think it's a balance, right? So AI stuff is going to remove some jobs from a certain segment of the engineering and creative community. I do think, though, it will be balanced with more work that's added as a result. So anyway, just to clarify that.
Oh, I appreciate that. And, I think it just goes to show, like, this industry has always been ever evolving and it's always adapting, and we have to get used to that. It's going to happen. The writing is on the wall that new things are going to come out that we're going to have to figure out how to work with. And you either go with the flow or you don't, and you lose those gigs. And who knows, like, I'm just making this up off the top of my head, but, maybe we'll reach a point where, LANDR's technology or whoever's technology is so good that this becomes a new sound. It's like when people looked at Auto-Tune originally, they thought like, what is this garbage tool that corrects people's voices? And, and like, how dare they? And now it's become an accepted sound, and it's like part of like genre. It's like kind of an identifying factor of certain people's sound, and it's like people have just embraced it. And so who knows, maybe one day like this automated stuff will become something people are used to hearing, and maybe that's just, maybe that's something people like, and then there'll be some other offshoot of that,
Who knows? That's what I say. It's going to be so crazy, where all this lands. And God, now, yeah, and you sprinkle in, the metaverse and Web3 and working in Atmos now and all this other stuff that's out there. I mean, all of that are job opportunities, that didn't exist a few years ago.
For sure. Man, I love that. And so speaking of new technologies, I know we've talked a lot about LANDR, but you're also focusing on your mastering side of things. You're doing a lot more Atmos work as well. And I'm curious to talk about that because that is a new technology that a lot of people still don't understand. And I'll admit, I don't know a lot about it either. Like I know of it, but I've never worked in it personally. And I think there's a lot for people to learn about getting into it because it's becoming a new thing that people should be aware of.
Yeah, well, this is a whole other nut to crack, but Atmos is interesting, right? So to be clear, I got into working in Atmos maybe like 4 or 5 months ago. So, meaning that I built an Atmos studio with my partner, Matt Geiler, who's a very well-known film trailer. He does like Spider-Man, No Way Home and Venom and all these massive movies. So we kind of built a studio together where I'm kind of the music professional and he's he's been working in Immersive for 20 years, right? So he's a master at that in Atmos and all of this stuff. So we kind of joined forces because I've not worked in Immersive very much in my career. I've been a kind of a stereo guy, like a lot of people, right? So it's been a huge learning curve, and it's just really interesting, right? I mean, so now when you go to get your music mixed, you can, you get your stereo mix, and if you want, you can add on an Atmos mix, right? Which is going to be a mix that has, at least, mixed to 7 speakers around you, 4 in the ceiling, and 1 or 2 subwoofers, whatever. There's various, versions of that. And at first, artists and me, when I think about that, I'm like, wait a second, who the hell has that many speakers in their house to listen to this music that I'm mixing in this like specialized environment, right? Which is the big challenge of Atmos for people, I think. It's like, okay, so I'm going to spend this money to have my music presented in this way. How is anybody ever going to hear that? Okay, so somebody has a sound bar maybe with some satellite speakers, right? All right, they're going to get a kind of a version of that Atmos mix, which could be very cool. But we all know most people are walking around listening to music on headphones and AirPods, right? So that's what 80, even Dolby, right, who the inventors of Atmos will say that I think 85% of people listen on headphones. Of consumers. So what the hell does this mean to them, right? So that's where you see things like, the binaural rendering of an Atmos mix. Like how does it translate to headphones? Can I hear things behind my head? Can I hear things above me? And that's the most challenging part, not to go off on a tangent on this, but of mixing in Atmos. Mixing in an immersive room, when you're sitting in a studio with 12 or 13 speakers, it's easy to mix in that, right? Stereo is hard, right? Trying to cram something between 2 speakers and carving stuff up with EQ and compressing things and trying to create this illusion of depth and the phantom center and all of that is incredibly difficult. If I can just pan something behind me to a speaker, that's pretty simple, right? The challenge to me with Atmos is making that translate to headphones. That's been our biggest struggle is to really, there's all sorts of, it's the Wild West as far as Atmos goes right now. So everybody is coming up with their own strategy about how to do this, but making something that translates in a room or on a soundbar or in a car that has Atmos and also will give somebody an additional experience to the stereo on headphones. And that is possible. Good Atmos mixes translate binaurally to kind of a spatialized, more open version of what the stereo is. And some of them, if they're not done right, they sound terrible. And there's a mixture of both. You can go on Apple Music right now and hear some amazing Atmos mixes and hear some trash. So it's the Wild West. But it's a very interesting space to kind of delve into. Last thing, because you can play around with Atmos even if you don't have an Atmos studio, right? You won't be able to hear it in a proper room, but you can certainly hear what it sounds like on headphones. All the stuff I've just been talking about, as a lot of people listening may know, that's built into Nuendo. It's built into Logic. The Dolby renderer that you can go get a a fairly lengthy demo of connects to Pro Tools and any other DAW that supports Atmos mixing. So there's a lot to play around with. It's not that complicated to get it set up and get going, but like a lot of things, it takes a lot of hours to perfect.
For sure. So for people who are interested in getting into Atmos or at least experimenting with it, I mean, you alluded to the fact that people can get started with just a simple set of headphones.
Yep.
You know, what else is needed for them to try this out and to experiment with it?
Dude, that's pretty much it. You need a DAW that supports mixing in Atmos, right? Which a lot do. And then you need either so I work in Pro Tools as an example if I'm mixing in Atmos, right? So I have Pro Tools. Now, what's really cool about this for any of you who use Pro Tools is that you used to have Pro Tools Ultimate, like the expensive version of Pro Tools, which is now called, as of a month ago, Pro Tools Flex. They changed the name again. But now in the standard version of Pro Tools, right, you have the ability to mix Atmos. So you don't have to have anything special, just a regular version of Pro Tools. And you have to have the Dolby Atmos renderer program. So it's a piece of software you download. It sits on your desktop, and you connect that through a driver, very easy to do, in your playback engine to this renderer. So you're basically streaming music out of Pro Tools into this rendering program, and that goes to your headphones. And that's it. And it might sound complicated. It is like literally 2 or 3 button clicks to get that up and running. And then, just learning the basics of what objects are and some of the stuff that the Atmos terminology. But I have to say, it's like I would say in a day or an afternoon, you could probably go through any, and even the Avid website has a lot of information. Logic's website has a lot of information about this. You can get set up and start playing around and probably make some great stuff and some terrible stuff, but that's kind of how you got to start, right? So you don't need a lot, I guess is my point.
So as far as that, because you mentioned that the DAWs already have the ability to mix within it, but then you need this Dolby Atmos renderer plugin. Is that something that is like a free thing, or is that something you have to purchase to get into it? Or
So to be clear, it's not a plugin, it's a separate application. There are plugins that you can use that are Dolby related that can talk to that program, but it's always going to be a separate application. So if you don't, some DAWs, and I mentioned this earlier, have it built in. So like Logic recently just came out where the render is built into Logic. If you own Logic, update to the latest version, you have everything you need self-contained within Logic. Nuendo is the same way. But most DAWs don't have that yet. So you have to go get the separate piece of software. And I think, don't quote me on this, but I think you get like a 90-day free trial. So like try that out and you got tons of time. And I want to say it's $300 to buy. So, but you got plenty of time to kind of futz around with it. And I think it's one of those things that you will continue to see, since Atmos doesn't appear to be going anywhere. You'll see it built into more, I won't mention names, built into more of these DAWs. So it just comes free effectively with the DAW. But right now, that's only the case for a few.
For sure. And then, so that's how you would get started with it, on a super basic level, just having the headphones. But then I'm assuming like people who are doing this professionally, they're starting to build out like their 7 point, whatever the big systems are, right? Yeah,
they are. And here, this is actually interesting. One of the things that I've found working in this space is that, so you have people like me, right, who have a proper Atmos studio, which is, as you might imagine, freaking expensive to build. And Dolby has to come, you have to get on Dolby's list to come tune it and to get listed on the Dolby website. Some major labels will not work with you unless you're listed on Dolby's website and you're a Dolby approved. Okay. So like forget about even mixing for, Universal Music Group as an example. They are going to vet the hell out of you. But, if you're just an independent artist and you want to do it on headphones and release it, great. The problem, of course, then is it may sound good on headphones, but it may sound abysmal if it's ever played in a movie theater or in a, on a sound bar or God forbid, in a proper Atmos room. So what a lot of people are doing is they're doing it themselves on headphones in their room. All right. So they don't have all the speakers. And then they send it to an Atmos mastering engineer to just QC it. So basically, listen to it in a proper room and just give them feedback to say, nope, this is perfect, you're good, or man, you really need to pull this or that down, or maybe I can do that as the mastering engineer, make those adjustments on my end, and do that. So it costs less than sending it to an actual mixing engineer, because it, of course, takes less time. But you still are kind of, protected against putting something out there that's going to fall apart. Because, of course, the whole idea of mastering, right, is things should translate no matter where you listen to them. And this is just another extension of that in the Atmos space.
Of course, yeah. So you had mentioned the idea of needing to be Dolby approved or Dolby certified or whatever. Is that you need that in order to be put on like the Apple Music, like in their spatial audio? Is that something you need, or can anyone who doesn't have that still make mixes that get approved for Apple Music and all the distributors?
This is so complicated. So like this has changed several times. Anybody who's listening to this who's involved in Atmos in any way has probably got gray hair because of this. So there used to be a certification program, like an actual certification that you had to go through to get like a stamp that says you can do Dolby Music. That doesn't exist. They got rid of that. Okay. That still exists for theatrical and home theater Dolby mix rooms. Like you actually get a little thing that says that you're approved for that. And that's required to work with Netflix and people like that. Right. But for music, they removed that, which I think was probably smart. Now, so anybody can go. So to your question, you personally could go download the software to do this, put a mix in Atmos, send it to Apple Music, and you're good. Right? It's going to show up. It's going to play back in Apple Spatial. There are no hurdles that you have to jump over to qualify for this, that, or the other. Where those hurdles apply is with some of the major labels. If you happen to be working with them, where they have a quality standard that they're trying to implement, since Dolby's kind of not doing that anymore. So what they'll say is, it's great, good for you that you spent $100,000 or whatever you spent building an Atmos facility, but that's not enough. We want Dolby to have given you the thumbs up. There needs to be like a tuned room. Even though there's not a certification anymore, there's kind of this like unwritten certification. So for us, they really wanted us to be listed on Dolby's site. I think there's 450 studios on there internationally at this point. And to do that, Dolby wanted to tune the room and all this other stuff I mentioned. So getting into the weeds a bit here. So it's still, again, man, it's the wild, wild west when it comes to this kind of stuff. But long story short, anybody listening to this can go kind of mess around and create an Atmos mix, and you can put it out and no one's going to stop you. Yeah,
for sure. I love that. And I think that because it's becoming more accessible, I think a lot of these kind of rules or standards that people are expecting, a lot of that will probably get swept under the rug at some point, because people will realize like, oh, you don't need to have all these things to make amazing sounding mixes. It's like people like going to, back in the day, people had to go to a big studio to get a good mix. And now it's like, yeah, someone in their basement can do a great mix as well. So it's becoming more accepted, right?
Yeah, we're getting there. The Atmos thing is still tricky to be able to do something. It's the translation issue, man, between binaural and the actual room that's crazy. And think about, I'm guessing people listening to this might be thinking the same thing I was, which is still like, do we really need this? Like, really? I mean, it's just kind of listening on headphones. It's kind of like stereo, but enhanced a little bit. Like, what's going on? Well, the reality of this is you got to look a little farther ahead to a lot of the VR, particularly the AR stuff, AR glasses, the need for immersive audio that shifts kind of as you move within a space, metaverse stuff. That's where Apple and a lot of companies are trying to amass. And I'm not giving any secrets away here. They haven't told me this, but this is the case. Just amassing a content library that will be readily available as they continue to move into that space. It's just like Mastered for iTunes, right? They wanted to amass a 24-bit content library so they could then put that, as another tier or another incentive for their streaming platform, and they did. And this is comparable to that.
Yeah, and that's great. And it's you can kind of like, the more we're talking this over, the more I'm realizing just like you can really see the trajectory of the music industry and where people are going with it, and like how all of these new technologies are going to come together and utilize music just as part of these other immersive experiences. And like you said, like the AR stuff and all that stuff. There is. It's not just going to be people listening to music anymore. It's going to be people experiencing music.
It's an experience. My God, look at Roblox, man. Like, look at look at if you're not familiar with a company called Splash, they used to be called Popgun. Building experiences I'm just using Roblox as an example, but it could be any metaverse-y, Fortnite-y type thing where people can interact with music in a different way. Spotify just had their first installation in Roblox where you can go actually kind of engage with music. We're used to doing that in things like Beat Saber and, some of these kind of music games, but where music changes dynamically in response to a lot of things, whether it's, an action of yours or it's your heart rate or your mood or all these different things. I mean, the adaptive music space is a whole other angle to this that I'm kind of messing with. So there's just so much crazy stuff happening. And you made a really good point a minute ago. If you want to see where things are heading, don't look at what consumers are asking for. Look at what companies are doing, right? So like the Atmos thing is a good example. Do you think that the average person is sitting on their couch being like, man, I wish I had, 13 speakers and could listen to music that way? No, like immersive music has failed many times over the years. Because it's not really applicable to people because people don't sit in one place and listen to music, right? So it's this binauralization of it. It's attaching it to visuals, which is so important. And now that we're at a stage technology-wise where we're looking at augmented reality glasses and more in the VR stuff and things that are portable, like now it starts to make more sense. Therefore, Dolby, Apple, others are pushing it because that's what we're going to start seeing. So consumers will adopt this technology these companies are making. They're not just relying on what the consumer wants because that's not where innovation typically comes from.
For sure. Yeah, there's a great Henry Ford quote that I'm probably going to butcher, but he said if he had asked people what they wanted back in the day, they would have said faster horses, right?
Yeah, it's true, man. It's like you can't, I mentioned this earlier, like God bless, traditional studio cats, like they're not the people you go to see where the industry is going to head. You know what I mean? Like you need people who can kind of see, or maybe they're good at that too, but a lot of people aren't, right? They're just used to, they got their head down, they're used to doing what they're doing. And it would just be that until the end of time if they had their druthers. So we can't, typically look to those type of people for where things are heading.
Yeah. And to also kind of tie back to what we talked about earlier, this is just yet again another area in music that isn't the traditional thing that people can start immersing themselves into. Excuse the pun, and starting to make money off this. I was actually having a great conversation with another well-known engineer not too long ago, and we were talking about Atmos because he had just recently converted his studio, and he kind of described it as like this gold rush right now with all the labels.
He's totally right.
Because he's like every label is like, whether they know it or not, like they're all in right now on Atmos and what this could potentially be used for. Like people don't have the clarity on what this is going to be used for yet, but he's like, they're all just freaking out and just trying to like hire whoever they can to get these Atmos mixes done. And he's like, yeah, like I'm busier than ever doing Atmos. Like, sure, new technology, like, whatever, I'll take it on. And he's keeping busy. So
it's true. It's really interesting. I've talked to some well-known Atmos engineers who behind the scenes are a little bit skeptical about the format, but it's like, if a label's knocking on your door and saying they're going to pay you this many thousands of dollars for a mix and here's, 500 mixes to start, what do? You know what I mean? Do you say, nope, I don't think this is innovation, I don't like it? Yeah, it's like you got to make a decision at some point. So that's why you see so many engineers pursuing this because there's so much damn work in it right now. And yeah, there is. It is like a gold rush. He's totally right, whoever said that.
Yeah. Well, for everyone listening to this, I hope that you're realizing that there's just so much potential out there, and sometimes it's just thinking outside of the box and really adapting and just moving with the times and not being that cranky old sound guy that doesn't ever accept new technology. You have to get with it, and it's really. There's a lot of money to be made in this industry, despite the fact that people think there isn't, and you just have to go looking for the different avenues for it.
Yeah. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being cranky old sound guy. A portion of me is cranky old sound guy. So I don't want to sound like I'm, talking shit about people like that. I totally get it. We're all cranky about certain things, make all of us cranky in our own ways. Certain things are off-putting to all of us in different ways. So it's okay. It certainly no need to go embrace everything that's happening. But what you said is really true, is that, if you want to make a living, if you want to exist in the long term, right, and have a career, you do kind of have to be a little bit more open-minded to this type of stuff. Hit up some of these companies. A last example of this, there's a company called The Sandbox, which is now pretty significant. They're a metaverse gaming platform. And I hit them up, a cold call, like year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, hit them up and was like, hey, what are you doing? I didn't know anything about the metaverse or about blockchain or anything like that back then. And this is a blockchain-based metaverse gaming situation before Snoop Dogg was involved in it and all these other, companies that have come on board. And I was like, do you need music? Like, I don't know anything about what you're doing, but like, I can make music. Like, what are we doing here? And they were like, yeah, no one's reached out to us. We're a perfect example. We're focused on the visuals, on the gaming engine. We haven't even thought about music at this point because a lot of people, anyone who's worked in film and television knows a lot of the last thing on a lot of these people's minds is music. So you can be proactive and approach some of these people. And yeah, they were like come on, let's bring on a team. Let's do the music for this platform. And that's, again, something I'd never done before. I've mastered music for games, but not made it, and did pretty well. Brought some friends in, and they're now continuing to do music. And I'm kind of, mixing and overseeing from a distance, and it's been great. But that's just like reaching out to something that seemed a little weird to me and a little unfamiliar. And they weren't used to music cats reaching out to them.
I love that story. And I love the courage in that story of just like, I don't know what I'm doing with this company, but can I help you? It's like, that's amazing. I love that. It's something you haven't done before, but just going all in on it to see if it's worth exploring or if there's work there. So, man, Daniel, this has been a really fun conversation. I love just hearing I love hearing from people that are in the tech space and seeing where the potential is for the future of music and how the industry is shifting. And, to hear from someone who has had that traditional role in music to some degree, and just the fact that you're help pushing it forward. It's just such a cool conversation to have, and great to hear and learn from. So thank you for taking the time to do this today. Appreciate it. Dude,
thank you for having me. I realize it's a bit wide-ranging conversation, but I hope it was useful. And just everybody, man, get out there. Hit me up, by the way. I don't use social media much, but I'm on all over LinkedIn. That's kind of been, one of the secrets to my success is that platform. Feel free to pester me about anything, questions, whatever. I'm always around.
So that was my conversation with Daniel Rowland, and I really enjoyed that. I thought that it's a really important chat to have, and all of us who are looking to make a career in this industry, we need to be looking ahead. We need to be looking at the technologies that are out there right now that are potentially disrupting, I use that in quotes, the industry, because a lot of those technologies out there are moving the industry forward. And we do have to be aware of those things, how they're affecting the landscape of the music industry right now. And we do need to embrace some of these things to some degree, because there may be a future with these technologies, and we do have to get used to it. And I think that when you talk about AI in music, a lot of people get really defensive about it. And I think a lot of that is heavily rooted in people just wanting to be traditional and not wanting to embrace change. But the fact is, the industry is always changing, and you can either move with it or you don't. And you can be left behind if you don't. Now, personally, do I think that some of these technologies that we talked about here today are at a pro level and that everyone should be using these? No, I don't. And, I think it's like Daniel and I talked about here, where there are applications for some people for some of the stuff. And then there are some people who are at a level above where this technology is at right now. So depending on which side of the fence you're on, you might want to use it or you may not want to. So the choice is yours. But, again, you do need to always be thinking about what technologies exist now and where are things heading. And also the fact that some of this technology is in its infancy stage, and it might not be the greatest right now, but as technology evolves, this technology might get better and better, and we might reach a pro level with it. So again, this is why we need to be paying attention to it and having these kinds of conversations. So that's really why I wanted to have Daniel on this podcast, because I think that he brings us a fresh perspective. And I have to say that by the end of this conversation, even for myself, I personally feel like I started to change my views of AI and how it could be used in the future. And yeah, I just thought this was a really great chat. So I hope that you found that informative. I hope that you found it inspiring, that maybe it has you starting to think about where the future of the industry could go and what it might entail and how you want to move forward with that. So Daniel, if you are listening to this podcast, thanks again for being on. I think this was really inspiring and people needed to hear this. So with that said, we have reached the end of the episode. And as always, if you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, definitely make sure to do so. And also make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. And that is where I help out musicians with creating pro-sounding recordings from their home studios. There are a ton of great resources on the website, everything from books to courses to coaching and a whole bunch more. If you're looking for help with your recordings and you want to take the guesswork out of the process, then definitely visit MasterYourMix.com. All right, guys, that is it for this one. Thanks again for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. Talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.